When my tears turn to laughter, that child long ago, my soul starts to linger. It's home, I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me along to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam.
The shire town of Pictou County, which borders the Northumberland Straits and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is also the heartland of Scottish settlement in Atlantic Canada. Walk the streets of Pictou town today. They read like chapters from the place's evolution. A free port, a center for international trade, a community that changed the face of Nova Scotia's education system. A town that has traditionally looked to the sea for its grounding has come full circle today, capitalizing on its history, going back to its waterfront roots, which gives the place a renewed vitality.
Mackenzie, Smith, Fraser, Murray, MacDonald. Names commemorated here. Names from the passenger list of the immigrant ship Hector. Sailing from their homeland July 10th, 1773, landing in Pictou Harbor September 15th of that year. They fled oppression and sought a new Scotland, Nova Scotia. This August morning, as the PEI-bound ferry Confederation disappears on the horizon, the fishermen work their grounds. In Gertrude Holton's Pictou, these are some of the things that give her a sense of place.
When we were growing up, Sunday was a pretty quiet day. You didn't do very much on Sunday, but you could go for a walk with your father. Two of our favorite walks, one was to the cemetery, which sounds morbid, but you learn your local history off those old headstones. The other thing was, another favorite walk was to the wharf. And in those days, invariably, there'd be a deal boat in, maybe from Denmark, maybe from Germany. And you had the sense, well, yes, you live in a little town way down here in Nova Scotia, but you could step on a boat right here and go anywhere in the world.
It's like the sea has ushered in a tide of renewal, reawakening a sense of history. The reconstruction of the ship Hector is today a focal project of a waterfront renaissance. A decade in the works, the 200-ton three-master will be a floating monument to the community's beginnings. With today's population of about 4,500, Pictou has weathered the vagaries of resources like coal, lumber, and fish, as well as industries such as shipbuilding. Situated on a head of land, bypassed by the main flow of traffic, has carried mixed blessings for the community. Being insular has contributed to the preservation of its 19th century character. Roy Barkhouse's world, lobstering.
When I first started to fish, we hauled all by hand. Them lines, we'd haul them across the boat, all by hand. And then we got to the haulers. And my son now, he has everything I knew, and all the marks I have, he has it on a scribbler. I had to remember it in my head, but he now has it in the scribbler, and which is great for me that I can look back and know he's got everything that I knew on a scribbler. Today they have the Loran C and they have the radar. And in my day we had to have our marks from a compass and we sailed by that.
Since the time of the Micmac, the water has influenced the way of life. Carolyn Vino expresses this idea in her work.
I started painting when I was about 16. I just started at the kitchen table and started doing pictures. I think the first one I ever did was of a boat and water and that. My sister at that time was painting also, and she was a big influence in my painting. I would just love to be able to go and throw the freedom that I have with other things into the sea part of my paintings, into the seascapes. In the sea, it's the moodiness, it's the moody quality that it has, or the calmness, or the ever-changing emotions that you get from the sea.
Once visited by French fur traders and missionaries, the natural harbor in the heyday of sailing was key as a supply base for northern Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, the Magdalens, and Cape Breton. It was the site of a 1765 Philadelphia Company land grant, but it wasn't until the arrival of the 200 survivors of the clearances and Culloden that a lasting social effect began.
They couldn't get land around the harbor and were forced to go way back into the interior. Most of them were not farmers because, you know, you didn't learn to farm in the Highlands of Scotland. They were fishermen, they knew about fishing, but they did not know about farming. And they arrived here with trees down to the shore. It was pretty discouraging. But somehow they made it. Hector sailors came ashore with a piper, playing the pipes, and that there were native people on the shore to welcome them, but when they heard the bagpipes, they all ran into the woods.
This visual record from the Pictou sketchbook by William Hind describes the town in its beginnings, a town that at the start of the 19th century, with a population already of 5,000, would benefit from a chance visit by a 27-year-old educator and reformer. A member of the Secessionist Church and slated to a congregation elsewhere, fate would intervene, causing him to remain. His legacy prevails. Historically known as the Harbor Congregation, the First Presbyterian Church pays tribute to Thomas McCullough. Once a pastor here, he went on to challenge the powerful Nova Scotia Anglican establishment of the time and founded in 1816 the first open, non-denominational school for higher learning.
Thomas McCullough, he had been born, I believe it was Renfrewshire in Scotland, and he had trained as a minister and had come here on his way to Prince Edward Island. But because it was late in the season and he couldn't get across, they were forced to put up here in Pictou, and a delegation of Pictonians who had heard that he was here went to see him and noticed he had 2 globes. And they were terribly impressed with this, and right away they thought, well, we have to prevail on this man to stay here, which they did. And I believe this was 1803. McCullough was here till 1838, during which time he founded the academy and fought really hard to have it made in university. At one time, they were graduating probably more lawyers, ministers, doctors than any other school in the country.
Stories of the sea.
I'd be about 14 when I first got involved with my father. The boat at that time would cost about $800 fully equipped. Today's boat would cost $100,000. We had an older fisherman in which I learned a lot from fishing from him, and he was very clever. And we were out there one day, and it was thick of fog, but very calm. And I had one of the first depth finders, and his son said, Barco's outside there. He's fishing. He must have found a piece of bottom. And Eddie said, he said, no bottom out there, it's ours.
For Carolyn, when she began to paint, it was at the family kitchen table. And now, well, things have come full circle.
I set up in a spare room upstairs, and I tried to paint up there, and I just felt so alone and isolated that I moved back down into the kitchen at my kitchen table, because there are always people dropping in, and you know, the phone is ringing and stuff like that, and I don't want to be totally out of touch with the world. I've gone out on location and I've painted, but like the tide would be out, I'd be standing there on the shore at my easel, and one day I looked in, and here was my easel and me right up to the knees in water without even realizing the tide had come in.
Reading a place's history through its buildings is an intriguing way of appreciating a town's story. Pictou boasts a variety of architectural influences, which originate from its early prominence as a free port.
I went from grade 1 to grade 5 in McCullough's original school. Even at that age, we had a sense of history in that building, probably because of the principal who really fed us on Pictou history. It wasn't on the curriculum. She just loved it, and we were forced to learn. At the time, it was a little tedious, but I've been so grateful ever since. I often think it was a great advantage. I lived here from the time I was born till 1949, and we didn't own a house until latterly, so we moved quite a bit. Every house we moved in had a romantic, historic interest. On Church Street, we lived in what had been Harper's Hotel, and it doesn't take much stretch of the imagination to picture people arguing the pros and cons of Confederation. And just along the street from Harper's Hotel was a beautiful stone house which had been Lorraine's Tavern. And in the newspapers of the 1820s, they give account of St. Andrew's night at Lorraine's Tavern. And believe me, it was a lively evening. So all these houses had a place in the stage of the development of the town. Of course, the stone houses are distinctly Scottish in flavor, both in materials, because Scotch people were noted for their stonework, and they carried those skills with them. But as people prospered, they built larger and better frame houses, and other influences such as New England, because we were very close to New England. In the summer, this wave of people came home from the United States. And this was reflected in the architecture too.
Built heritage and place names in an unfolding history of Pictou Town, the town that was the setting for the first commercial manufacturer of chloroform, is today the town that is a recipient of a more recent innovation. Pictou is the setting for a Canadian manufacturing success story. Following the Second World War, the Groman family arrived from Czechoslovakia. And within a few years, Groman, a craftsman, began to change the way a knife was made. Norman Babinak.
It's one of the first drop point knives in the market for knives, basically in the world. It's copied now by virtually every other manufacturer in the world. Most of the knives years ago were just designed based with European and English designs, were something that was passed down from century to century, basically. But very few people have actually sat down to find out why it was designed, why it had this particular shape. And the Russell belt knife was one of the very first ones that there was actually some technical timing and engineering sort of going into the actual design of the knife.
It was named after its originator, D.H. Russell, once an assistant to Prime Minister Mackenzie King. The knife, a favorite with outdoor enthusiasts, came about as a result of a series of published appeals to Canadian manufacturers.
He was always approached by a lot of American hunters who always come up to Canada. They're always looking for a Canadian knife, not the Bowie-style knife with the sharp sort of jagged edges and whatnot on it, which weren't very functional in dressing game. And my mother, Berta Babinak, she came across one of these articles and responded to Mr. Russell.
With a wealth of resources nearby, confrontation between France and Britain in the early 1800s was what gave Pictou its first economic thrust.
The town began to prosper during the Napoleonic Wars, largely because of the export of lumber, the tall white pine, which they needed for spars for naval ships. After the middle of the 1800s, they discovered coal, and there began to be wealth around too, and you can tell that by walking the back streets in town. And there were, well, at one time, 13 inns. Of course, this was the end of the line. You didn't go any further when you got to Pictou. They said that you could go into taverns on the waterfront in Pictou and hear languages spoken from practically every country in the world, from the crews of all these ships which were coming in.
Memory is of a way of life.
My mother was always busy knitting headings in the winter months, doing nets for other fishermen and things like that. So it was always, our whole life was around the fishing industry. My mother used to have a cookhouse, and she used to cook all the lobsters as they came in, and we had to go and deliver them a lot of times, and deliver them by hand, you know, running with a dozen here and a dozen there. They would have to make enough to do them all winter. So you charged your groceries all winter until fishing season, and then you paid your bill at the end of the fishing season, you know. All the fishermen have their own grounds, and it's passed on, I think, from generation to generation, like that's your territory and that's it.
In the side bottom, the fishermen that fished behind Pictou Island, like, and then they called the middle grounds, and west end of Pictou Island, and Cobalt, and Norwest Banks, and these are the bottoms that we fished on. They fished anywhere from 3 fathom to 15.
There was, it was a little wharf right down at the end of this road, and it was called Shaw's Wharf. My father and Jack Green, 2 fishermen, had been given it as it was like a dredge. They just put it into the shoreline, and they fished off the wharf. And as children, we were always down around the boats and jumping the boats from back and forth and swimming around the water. And it was just where you grew up.
Best memory I have is the first day of lobster fishing. We all get together. We have to go at a certain time, which was 6 o'clock. Everybody be racing for their spot to get there first, to get the first set. And I mostly had a fairly fast boat, and I think that's the best memory.
The rebuilding of the Hector has come to signify many things for the town. A touchstone, maybe. But most important, it has become a tie to the circumstances in which the community was born. People fleeing persecution, sacrificing much for the opportunity to start anew. History is a way for society to keep in touch.
Over here we have the sailboats, the first that fished in when they first landed. We have photos of all the old fishermen way back. It's very interesting to the visitors, the tourists, and also my grandchildren come, and we can show them how their grandfather fished and how they lived at them days at the shore, and I think it's very interesting.
Subconsciously, some of the people from the past are coming into my work. without me really realizing it, but as soon as somebody sees the painting, they'll say, oh, that's exactly like my father, you know. The Irish fisherman is very similar to Bennett Poirier, and he was a local fisherman that has come to life in the painting. I think I'm a very up person. Like I'm really happy and I'm really go-lucky and I'm smiling all the time and that. And I think that if I lived in the prairies or anything, any place away from the water, I wouldn't have that happiness inside. Like it would just crush me. I know it would. I have to have the water. I have to see it in the morning, and it's a very big part of my life.
I've been in Ottawa and these places. A week is enough. Down here where it's quiet and you're free. And that's one thing about fishing, you know. You had your own time. You weren't punching no card or anything else. It's just you go and come and do as you like. And it's the way to live. I do though.
McCullough, Cameron, Ruffs, the McLeods. Names that are listed today alongside the O'Briens, the LeBlancs, and the Babinecks. People from varying heritages who together have taken up this place and have forged a community. The people who come together to celebrate each year in the Lobster Carnival their collective memories, aspirations, their identities.
The harbor is what you remember about Pictou and what we all loved about Pictou, because we swam in it and we sailed on it, and most of us could never wait to get back to it. I don't suppose everybody thinks the way I do, but I think it's very important that we know where we've come from. I know it's a cliche to say, you know, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you came from, but I happen to believe it. Particularly when it's so interesting. Those are the things that we're attracting people here because of, I think.